Really rely on guests coming in here on regular days to remind me, especially after long weekends, what day it is. And I've been pretty good today to say that it's Tuesday, and seeing Mike Faher here in the studio reminds me that it's Tuesday because that's our regular visit with members of the media. Good to see you, Mike.
Good to be here.
And of course, Mike is a member of all the media in southern Vermont, VTDigger.org, as well as the Brattleboro Reformer and the Commons, and somebody who has been covering all the stories around Vermont Yankee. A lot of the meetings lately of the nuclear citizens, let me see if I get this right. This is such a mouthful, isn't it, Mike? The VYNDCAP group, right?
Yeah.
A Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel set up by the state. Last week's meeting, which took place on Thursday, was a bit of a special meeting because the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the feds, were coming down to listen to people about this proposed sale and some of their concerns about it. This took some doing, just to give people a little background on this, and I know you had written about it because you sat in on the phone call that the NRC had at one point, and at one point that was it, right? That was going to be their one opportunity to hear public comment.
Yeah, the NRC wasn't required to have a meeting here. They're considering a license transfer, and apparently in that process there's no statutory requirement that they go to the host community and have a meeting. But there was enough of a, I don't want to say outcry, but support for a local meeting. And I think probably the biggest push for that was from the congressional delegation. They wrote a letter to the NRC that said, look, you got to come to Vermont.
Were they different in terms of their areas of expertise? Why four and why these four from the NRC?
Well, I think it was a nice representation. You know, there was an economist from the NRC there, and there was, some decommissioning experts, and there was also the gentleman who is sort of the Vermont Yankee project coordinator. So they could speak to pretty much anything from the NRC's point of view.
So they have somebody specifically dedicated to this project? That's how the NRC kind of parcels these things out?
Yeah, for all I know, he may have other, I doubt he has other decommissioning projects. It's such a big deal, and there are so few of them. But he's sort of the point person at NRC.
And I would imagine this whole decommissioning phenomenon, I mean, this is probably a relatively new aspect of the NRC's responsibilities, but a needed one. I mean, this isn't the first plan to be decommissioned, but it's also one of many that are about to go offline over the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to note, and I tried to note in my story that I think they said that they've done, there have been 10 reactors that decommissioned before this. But what's so unique about this is the what's being proposed, and that's that a decommissioning company come in, take outright ownership of the plant and the spent fuel, for the purposes of decommissioning. That's never actually happened before.
Right. Now, Thursday's meeting was a longer than normal meeting, right? You said it took over 3 hours.
Yeah.
They moved it to the multi-purpose room at the school, right? Because they were anticipating a bigger turnout. And was it a bigger turnout? Did more people come to this meeting than you've been seeing at some of the other VYNDCAP meetings?
Oh, yeah. I didn't do a crowd count, but the place was fairly full, which is very unusual for these meetings. And there was... I think a pretty broad representation from the community. But looking into the crowd, you could kind of predict how things were going to go, who was going to say what.
A lot of the usual suspects as far as from the PSB hearing, right? I mean, basically a lot of the things you heard from the community were things that people had heard when they sent them to the state. It was just a chance to get to say them to the feds.
Yeah, I think, one thing that struck me early on was how many people from Vernon came out, how many different people. People I hadn't heard from before. Of course, the viewpoint tends to be very similar. And at one point, I think they were outnumbering the
skeptics.
The skeptics, correct. Yeah. Probably 2-1, but then that evened out as the night went on. I think there was a good 90 minutes of public comment. So it was, I think the NRC got an earful.
Now, was that when you're talking about the people from Vernon? And Vernon, they've actually endorsed this as a town, right? This purchase of the plant from Entergy to North Star. Were they town officials who were coming and speaking that way, or were they private citizens, a little of both?
Yeah, it was both. There were some business people who came and spoke. There were town officials. The Planning Commission was there. I think most, if not all, the Planning Commission was there. Patty O'Donnell, who used to be on a select board, now's on a planning commission, got up and said, we want this, and we want to be able to get on with our lives in Vernon. Let us have this. So
Let us
essentially,
have it, right?
Yeah.
Well, and the story that you wrote about this, which was published in yesterday's Brattleboro Reformer, and people can find it on reformer.com, talks about NRC really basically sounding like they're trying to reassure people in this area about their confidence in North Star and North Star's ability to do this job. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think that they hew very, and it should be this way, they hew very closely to this is what we look at and this is what we don't. And it was, in that way, it was, I think, sort of educational or explanatory for some folks. But they, it's not clear to me how much of this public comment is going to factor in their decision. Quite frankly, a lot of the things I heard people talking about were legitimate issues, but not necessarily things that the NRC is going to have control over.
Right. Well, you anticipated the question is, did it feel perfunctory that the NRC was there because Senator Leahy and Senator Sanders and Peter Welch all called their office and said, you got to get up there and deal with this. All right, we'll go and we'll do this. I mean, they were reticent to do this. They felt the phone call that they had a few months ago was adequate. Did it feel like they were just there kind of like running out the clock, or do you think they actually were listening to some of the things, whether they were applicable or not, to their decision?
Yeah, I mean, from where I sat, they seemed sincere. They were listening. They one of the representatives said early on, we actually appreciate this, and we got a chance to tour the plant and see it with our own eyes, which is important. It's probably not. I don't know that that's something they would have done otherwise. Yeah, but I think at the end of the day, things like site restoration and whether or not rubble is buried there, it doesn't have much to do with the NRC.
Right. The details for them are about who's paying for this and does North Star have enough money to pay for it in the decommissioning fund. That was one aspect of it. And talk a little about the answers that they gave to those questions about funding.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to remember they're focused only on radiological decommissioning and terminating the nuclear license there. But two things they talked about were, in terms of future reuse of the site, they believe that North Star will have what they call unrestricted use once the site is released. And the other thing they talked about was funding, and they said at the end of the day, it's up to North Star to figure out, how to find the funding for this to address any shortfalls that may occur, and it's our responsibility to make sure they do that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what North Star has been saying as well, that they are, if we can't do this for the money in the decommissioning fund, we understand we have to foot the bill. Now, I know some people are concerned about what if there is no North Star? What if they go under? Is there a real danger of that? Are they from what we know about them financially, they don't seem to be any sort of dire straits.
No, I mean, they're a relatively new company in this the way they're structured right now. I think that there's a dichotomy here. There are people on the panel and in the audience who ask repeatedly, what happens if there is no North Star? What if North Star goes under and this job isn't done? And it's interesting because the NRC just doesn't answer that question. They don't see it that way.
Right.
They say, well, it'll be up to North Star to figure that out. North Star has to address this. And they say, we've done 10 decommissionings, they've all gone safely, and the licensee has found the money.
Yeah. Did anybody, the other part of this, and you characterized it in your story about reassuring people about the unrestricted use of the site after decommissioning being for North Star. Was there concern about that? I mean, it sounds to me like nobody really is necessarily concerned about what happens to the site afterwards, just that it gets cleaned up. And obviously, let's face it, I mean, unrestricted use does come with the caveat that there are going to be these dry cask storages full of nuclear waste in perpetuity for our purposes here of mortality, right? But I mean, so when they're talking about this unrestricted use, why do you feel that people need to be reassured on that point?
I think one of the reasons I focused on that is because I've heard criticism repeatedly saying, well, why are you writing about reuse of the site? Nobody's going to reuse that site. It's impossible. It's too small. There's nuclear waste there. It's not going to be suitable for anything. And so when I hear the NRC make such a confident statement that this site's going to be available for unrestricted reuse. Now, as you know, the caveat here, and I got into this in my story, is that there's going to be a section of that site that's under 24-hour guard because there's radioactive fuel on it. And it's a relatively small parcel. So the question that was left unresolved is how big is that fuel storage area going to be, and how will that affect how the site can be reused?
Right, because it's not just where it's stored, but the perimeter.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there has to be a certain buffer there before you even begin thinking about development of this space between those storage and just for security purposes. So a lot to consider there. NRC, in terms of timeline now, especially because we still do have one other PSB public hearing happening, where do they see the whole timeline for their decision on this sale?
They haven't committed to anything, but Entergy and North Star have asked to have a decision from the NRC by the end of the year.
Okay.
And concurrently, they're seeking approval from the state, and they're hoping for that in the first quarter of 2018.
Right. Does it matter to them to have the federal versus the state first? Does it matter which comes first to them?
Unless there's some technical reason that I'm not aware of, I don't see why.
Yeah.
I think they probably look at the process and think, well, this seems reasonable. But, of course, it's up to the NRC and it's up to the state.
Right. Now, Mike had another story about the Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel and a piece of legislation that will carry into 2018. I want to get his reaction to the decision by the Vermont legislature to table that piece of legislation, and we'll do that after the bottom of the hour news break. 52 degrees outside at 21 minutes before the 9 o'clock hour. Green Mountain Mornings continuing now. Your host, Chris Lenois, joined by Mike Faher, staff reporter for VTDigger, the Brattleboro Informer, and The Commons. Always good to have him in here on a Tuesday to talk about stories he's been covering. Now, we were talking about that Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel. By the end of this segment, I'm going to have it right.
Yeah.
And another story you had about it earlier in the week had to do with legislation around the formulation of this panel. This is a state-created body with real responsibilities. This isn't just people kind of, deliberating over the sale of Vermont Yankee as a mind exercise. They're supposed to advise the state. They're supposed to be the filter for input. Thus, that's why the Nuclear Regulatory Commission came to them and had their public hearing through the VYNDCAP process. But this process is something that maybe people aren't aware of, is trying to be tweaked by the folks on the panel. You wrote about this piece of legislation, H-144, which was basically trying to reconstitute the panel. Talk a little about what they wanted to see.
Yeah, the chairwoman, Kate O'Connor, had proposed tweaking the membership of the panel. There's 19 members. It's a pretty diverse panel, and there are currently 2 legislative seats on it. And she had proposed adding a 3rd legislator, and the effect of her plan would be that all 3 legislators on the panel would have been from Windham County. Currently, there's no mandate that either of the legislative representatives be from this area.
And one of them is Mike Hebert, who's appropriate to be on there, being the representative for Vernon, and the other is Mark McDonald, a Democrat senator from Orange County. Why was he put on the panel in the first place?
Well, these are the legislative appointees, but the reason that specifically those 2 folks were on, in part, was because there were 2 committees in the House and Senate where a member of those committees were supposed to be appointed to this panel. The problem, and we could probably say that technically Mike Hebert was still a member this year, because one of the committees in the VYNDCAP legislation doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
It was completely phased out at the beginning of this session. So technically they're down a member. And that's one of the reasons that Kate proposed this. She said, we got to at least change the language because it's just not, it's not correct. It doesn't sort of jive with reality at this point.
Well, it sounds like it also provided a very convenient opportunity to propose this, as you're saying, wanting more representation from Windham County. Mark McDonald, who you speak to in your article, did he want to be on this panel? I mean, or was it something that they said, all right, you're the guy to be on it?
Mark is an interesting character, especially for someone like me who hasn't covered this stuff for a long time. I've come to understand that Mark has been involved with this Yankee issue for a long time. He's been a legislator for a very long time. He was on the panel, the advisory panel, the nuclear advisory panel for the state that preceded VYNDCAP. So he's got a long history here. He is a vehement critic of energy and the NRC. And so, yes, he definitely wanted to be on this panel.
Well, then that begs the question. I mean, part of the reason this is being proposed as a restructuring is he has not been in attendance at a lot of the meetings, and he's coming from Orange County. I mean, that's not an easy trip in January or a lot of times during the year. So what does he say about his lack of participation in this process?
I think it should be noted, that I think Kate hasn't talked about this a lot, but one of the reasons this was proposed is neither of the legislative representatives were attending very often. And Mark hasn't talked about why he doesn't attend. I mean, certainly, as you note, it's not a short drive.
Yeah.
But, I think one of Kate's motivations here was to get consistent legislative representation. Her thought is this is a really important issue. It's important statewide, and we need people who can understand these issues and then take it back to Montpelier.
Yeah, I mean, if that's the role here to advise the state, you want the lawmakers on board with this, and you can't be on board with it unless you're going to the meetings. Now, McDonald tells you in the story that he feels that one of the reasons that they want him off the panel is because he's critical of Entergy, as you said. I think if you talk to Derek Jordan or some of the other people who were part of that panel or attended some of these meetings, I don't think he's really at odds with the overall sentiment about Entergy. I don't think anybody there is necessarily like, gee, I wish Entergy would stay around and keep working on this decommissioning process.
Mark has been, Senator McDonald has been very adamant in saying, in fact, he used the words Stockholm Syndrome. He thought the panel was suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, essentially, I don't know, I guess inferring that Entergy was somehow holding the panel captive. Yeah, he believes that he's sort of a voice in the wilderness and a strong critic of Entergy and the NRC and now North Star, potential buyer. And he thought that he was sort of being forced out so that the panel could become, in his words, more parochial.
Right. And it seems like basically the way the legislature has dealt with this is the way legislatures do when they don't want to deal with a bill. They remand it back to a committee, in this case, the Finance Committee, in the Senate, which he is part of, I believe, right? And so basically it's up to him whether this bill even comes up for debate. And if he's the one calling the bill up for debate and it kicks him off the panel, it's probably not going to come up for debate.
Well, that's one of the reasons. I mean, I would have written about this process regardless, but
right.
It died in the committee that Mark sits on.
Yeah.
After it had been altered by that committee. But to be clear, Mark has said that he would not vote on this bill at all when it was up there in Montpelier. And the other members of his committee that I spoke to said that he did not attempt to unduly influence. I have no doubt, though, that he spoke against it. That's Mark.
Well, and no attempt to influence it is accurate if you never bring it up for debate. I mean, you can say, I've never really tried to influence this piece of legislation because it's never come up. And whose responsibility is that? Senator McDonald's. Kate O'Connor is still hopeful this comes up in the 2018 legislative session. Would she tweak the bill? Is it a situation where she's looking to change some of the parameters of it to make it more appealing to at least get discussed? I mean, I think she has a point that, we need lawmakers to show up for this, and they should be Windham County lawmakers since we are the most directly impacted.
Yeah, I think she's fine with some of the tweaks that have happened, not to get too far into the weeds, but at this point, her goal is simply to have the state representative from Vernon named to it again, specifically, so that is sort of encoded in the law. That doesn't seem all that difficult. I can't imagine that doesn't get done in some way next year.
All right. Yeah. Well, certainly. And I guess by 2018, I mean, some people might be thinking, what does it matter, especially if we've heard from the NRC and the PSB from that point and they've approved the sale? Does it have any meaning to have this VYNDCAP board and have it reconstituted by that point?
I think it does. One of the things that this panel has done, and I think done pretty well from my perspective, is to educate the public and take public comment. And that's not going to stop even if the sale to North Star is approved. We're then going to go into decommissioning under North Star. And North Star has said that they intend to participate in the panel and keep the panel going. And right. I think there'll be a lot of questions about that project even once it starts. Yeah,
again, to continue to be that monthly conduit or however periodically they decide to meet, and maybe they don't feel they need to meet quite as frequently anymore, but certainly to have that conduit to filter input from people to the state, I think will be a valuable thing moving forward. Another story that you had written about with regards to legislation, and this was actually in last week's edition of The Commons, having to do with telemedicine. And you'd written about this a couple of different times before, both just as a service and now this piece of legislation. I don't know if the governor has signed this into law yet, but it is something that I don't see he would be opposed to signing it into law, this telemedicine legislation. Talk a little bit about what's in it.
Yeah, I don't think he has signed it yet, now that you mention that. But basically the idea was to expand insurance reimbursement for telemedicine, to make sure that when hospitals or specialists offer this service, that they know that they can get paid in some manner, and to offer that reimbursement at the same level that an insurer would reimburse for a doctor's office visit.
Right, and this is a service currently available to any hospital or practice. I mean, is it something where, we don't have too many independent practices anymore in this area, but we do have some. Everybody can kind of take advantage of this as a service, as a value-added service for their practice, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the aims of this is to be able to offer more service without, hiring more doctors
access to
or
specialists.
building more facilities, that sort of thing. And I think that's one of the reasons that the health insurance industry got behind it, was they see an opportunity here to improve outcomes, and without substantially raising costs.
Yeah, I think it sounds like a win-win for everybody. Hospitals are on board with it, insurers on board with it. The provision in the legislation that they can't charge any more for a telemedicine visit versus, or a telemedicine consult, probably a better way, during a doctor's visit than they would for other services. It almost seems to me that it will be a cost-saving measure for those very reasons. You don't have to build capacity and infrastructure for these specialists in an office. It seems to me that it's something that's going to help control the cost of healthcare.
That's the idea, and the retreat, for instance, sees this also as a way to decrease. I'll explain this, but they see it as a way to potentially decrease the number of people coming in and trying to get inpatient beds in the retreat. Because eventually what they'd like to do is, if a mental health patient goes to, let's say, the ER at BMH, a psychiatrist could phone in from the retreat to BMH and immediately intervene in that patient's situation, which is not something that's happening right now. And theoretically, if the person gets that early intervention and gets some quick treatment, they may not have to seek an inpatient bed at the retreat, and they certainly won't be sitting in the ER for a week or two waiting for that bed. So it could really have, I think, some real positive outcomes if it goes down that way.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned one of the changes they made as this went through the legislative process from the House to the Senate was getting rid of a list of healthcare providers: mental health workers, social workers, therapists, dietitians. Mm-hmm. Just a broader definition of healthcare provider ended up in the bill. Why do they feel that getting rid of that list was important, do you think?
I think the concern was probably that you can't cover all the possibilities, and especially down the road, of who might want to offer this service. So it's probably a wise move to be more general about it. Some other things that were added to the bill, they took that list out, but they also added some privacy provisions to make sure that patients understood what telemedicine is and what it's not, and to make sure that these things couldn't be recorded.
Yeah. Well, all these stories that we hear about healthcare changing, not necessarily for the better. It's nice to know that on the state level, it seems like the lawmakers are doing some things to make healthcare more accessible for people here in southern Vermont. Worth checking out Mike's story in the Commons, as well as all the stories he'll have over the course of next week. VTDigger.org, reformer.com as well. Anything you want to tease before I let you go, Mike?
Yeah, I'm going to be doing an update this week on the status of the spent fuel move at Vermont Yankee, and also a story about the expansion of Rescue Inc.
All right, we'll be talking to you about those at later times. Thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you.
And we'll be back to wrap up this edition of Green Mountain Mornings right after these messages.